Doom 64. Love it? Hate it? You probably never played it. At least not on an N64, that is. Don't feel bad though, hardly anyone did. The story of Doom 64 was almost tragic for such a delightful franchise. This thing flopped pretty hard when it first released. Hell, Glover 64 of all games likely stomped it in sales. Glover! What's kind of funny though was Doom 64 was basically the perfect storm of everything that could possibly go wrong at a game release. And today we're going to be taking a look at why. Oh, and just a quick side note before we get started, so you all don't crucify me. The point of this video is not to say that Doom 64 was a bad game. I actually quite like it. Also, I'm going to be using footage from the remastered version because I didn't want to try playing this with an N64 controller. It's basically the same, the original just looks a bit more crunchy. But anyways, let's go. The original Doom was some pretty good stuff, ran well, made a lot of money, and got ported to basically every platform under the sun. The big draw was it was most people's first experience with 3D gaming. For the first time ever, it was like you're really there in the video game. Not exactly groundbreaking by today's standards, but still pretty neat. Of course, there were a few caveats to that. The thing is, Doom wasn't really 3D, it was kind of like this make-believe 3D. The game world was actually just a big old 2D map made to look 3D through the wizardry of its programmer, John Carmack. This meant that there were a lot of things you just couldn't do with it, like, for example, rooms on top of rooms. Despite this, the Doom style of 3D rendering was pretty unmatched for a while. Though by 1997, Doom 64's launch date, it was starting to get a little bit dusty. Sure, the sprite-based graphics looked pretty fancy for the time, but the times were changing. 3D gaming was on that beautiful horizon, and people were more ravenous than a pack of imps to have at it. Ironically enough, it was the company that created Doom, id Software, that would go on to make what was effectively the Doom killer. Quake was the name, and it was the biggest, baddest, most 3D-ish shooter around. At least until Half-Life came to be, but that's a completely different story. This wasn't Doom's world anymore. From a tech standpoint, this was Quake's Earth, the PC title showing off some pretty fancy true 3D graphics and projectiles. The core gameplay is extremely similar to that of Doom's, but had all sorts of fancy features like swimming, complex aiming, and advanced platforming. This was the future of shooters. And, come on, who could say no to a rocket launcher that looks like this? Of course, Doom 64 wasn't the only old-timey shooter out there at the time. On the flip side, you had games like Duke Nukem 3D, which, while using a very similar make-believe style of 3D that Doom used, had so many tricks that it might as well have been a 3D game. Duke was a total hunk. He could jump, swim, go into a two-story building. Doom Guy couldn't do that. Also, Duke 3D put a lot of work into making their worlds look pretty realistic for the time, making him a lot more competitive. So while the title for coolest shooter was kind of hogged in PC space, the N64 had its own lineup of true 3D shooters to contend with. Ever hear of a game called GoldenEye 007? Pretty small indie title. You probably never played it. Well, anyways, this was on the horizon, and basically a completely different style of shooter. Cutscenes, advanced mission objectives, full 3D worlds, it definitely had a lot more going on than Doom 64, which still had that old-timey shoot-your-way-through-halls gameplay. There was also Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, which came out right before Doom 64. This one, This one didn't age quite as well, which is kind of a recurring theme for a lot of early shooters. Ironically enough though, the old-timey, rooty-tooty point-and-shooty of early Doom games kinda holds up a bit better than the clunky early 3D shooters. I mean, Quake's still a good time, but Turok, it's a harder sell. I like dinosaurs as much as the next guy, but first-person platforming with an N64 controller is... The other big thing these games were doing was complex AI. GoldenEye is probably the best example for this. Enemies in Doom games just sort of blindly stumble about, killing you through sheer volume or you just getting stuck on a bit of stuff. Enemies in these newer shooters could do all sorts of fancy stuff like follow patrol patterns and actively search for the player. Okay, these guys weren't exactly Einstein, but it was a step forwards. While the quality of all these different shooters varied drastically, they all were offering something new to players. New 3D-oriented gameplay, more realistic-ish worlds. Doom 64 was perceived as just another Doom, which, while an exciting prospect, can only get a game so far. You couldn't even really aim up and down in these games. Not that you would want to with an N64 controller anyways, but the point still stands. Also, it's worth noting that Doom 64 wasn't a total dinosaur. It did run pretty good on the hardware. A whole lot of Doom ports had a habit of running slowly or cutting out a huge chunk of the game to get it to work. Looking at you, Doom for the Super Nintendo. Doom 64, however, didn't even use the original version of the Doom engine either. Most of this bad boy was scripted from the ground up. This solid performance was probably the only upside it had to being on the N64. Okay, now this next bit is very important. I need you all to observe this cacodemon. Okay, good. Shit, what was I talking about? Oh, right. So anyway, the Doom series and the N64 were a bit of a match made in hell. When you think Nintendo, you generally think of family-friendly entertainment. Things along the lines of funny dancing monkeys and medieval twinks plunging their swords into any monster that moves. Bisecting demons and other hellspawn with a chainsaw is just a bit much. That's not to say M-rated games weren't a thing on the console, but they never really did all that well. Just look at Conker's Bad Fur Day. That game was basically a masterpiece. Great tech, good graphics. It was made by Rare, so you know it was the good stuff. It was so good, it even got a remake later down the road. Thing is, it ended up being one of the biggest flops on the system. While a good chunk of that was due to an awful marketing campaign, it was still the best M-rated experience on the console, and it tanked hard. Now, technically speaking, the N64 did two things really well for the time. It was powerful, and it had multiplayer. This bad boy was so fast your head would spin, load times weren't even a thing. That was the magic of early cartridge gaming, but it did have a cost. The storage space on the N64 cart was itty-bitty at best. Kind of a problem when you look at how the Doom games were made. The Doom games were sprite-based, which meant there were like 100 pictures of each enemy for every possible angle you might see them in. Now, as you can imagine, this was a bit less efficient than a 3D model that you could just pop into space and spin! One of the biggest laments of Doom 64's developers was just how much stuff they had to cut out to make room on the cartridge. Levels, monsters, and other oddities had to get taken out. On the bright side, though, the horrible monster known as the Archville got cut too, so hey, we got that as a plus. Also, they cut the soundtrack! Though that one was done more for artistic purposes, to be honest. The kickin' metal tunes were swapped out for spooky ambience. Doom 64 was basically trying to be a survival horror game this time around, hence all the focus on atmosphere and the complete and utter redesign of every enemy in the series. The emphasis on cool lighting and other horror elements were a real change of pace. Shame hardly anyone saw it at the time. Also, you want to know what's equally funny as it is tragic? Doom multiplayer was hella popular, super popular. The Nintendo 64 was super popular for its multiplayer. Do you know what was cut from Doom 64? It's multiplayer! It was the perfect opportunity! Wasted! The official reason was slow speed and split screen would kill the experience, but I think they probably just ran out of space on the cartridge. It's pretty hilarious when you think about it. Banjo-Tooie had a fully functional multiplayer shooting mode as an afterthought. Banjo-Tooie, but Doom didn't! At the end of the day, it's just kinda hard for Doom 64 to stand out when it was getting labeled just another Doom. There were all sorts of new shooters coming out at the time, and, well, each brought something new to the table. And ultimately, that came off as a bit more exciting. Things like story and 3D worlds were gonna be the hot thing coming up, and the whole point of the N64 was 3D graphics. Running through a Windows screensaver with a shotgun just wasn't immersive anymore, and people wanted something bigger, better. As you can see, this little sales pitch of ours is starting to fail quite miserably. There are already a bunch of shooters on the console that could provide more stuff and use the limited cartridge space more efficiently. Outside of the Doom branding, there wasn't much this game could give you that didn't already exist in some shape or form. just when you thought things couldn't get any worse for poor old Doom 64, another blow is struck. For you see, the game came out at the end of the Doom boom. No trend lasts forever, and fatigue was starting to finally set in. The original Doom was great, everyone loved Doom. Even Bill Gates was getting in on Doom fever.
These games are getting really realistic.
Anyways, they poured that thing to literally everything. You could run it on a toaster if you wanted to. Doom 2 was even better. People lost their minds over Doom 2. More monsters, better levels, it was great stuff. Then, years later, Doom 64 sneaks its way in. While in spirit this thing was basically Doom 3, so much stuff got cut, it'd be like if Halo 2 had less weapons and aliens than Halo 1. The question now was, what the heck does Doom 64 do for me? What can I get out of this? Its working title was Doom: The Absolution. I don't know why they switched to the name Doom 64, but it definitely bit it in the ass. Public perception was this was just another port, to a game that's been ported like 30 times. Hell, even reviewers at the time often referred to it as a version of Doom, despite being from the ground up a completely different game. A die-hard Doom fan isn't going to be breaking down doors for a new Doom campaign either. In case you didn't know, modding was in fact a thing back then, and Doom 2 had an ever-expanding library of user-created WADs. The WADs were what they called Doom mods, in case you didn't know. It's pretty sad too, as the Doom 64 campaign is pretty rock solid in my opinion. They had a new scripting system, so they could use all sorts of brutal traps and puzzles. Also, it was kinda neat how they went with a super atmospheric style of design. Again, it almost played like some sort of horror game like Resident Evil. A whole lot of work went into this thing too, with literally every monster getting redesigned. But hey, sometimes more effort doesn't always mean more success. It's morbidly funny how one of the loudest, most popular franchises ended with a whimper. A forgotten death rattle overseen by the plumber himself. Doom would go into remission after this, not becoming a thing again until the really wonky Doom 3 hit the shelves. What's ironic about this is Doom 3 was trying to be a survival horror game, much like Doom 64. But that's a completely different rabbit hole that we're not going to be going down yet. Anyways, fellas, it's time for a recap. Doom 64 face-planted at launch because its tech was hopelessly outclassed. The console was bad for the type of game Doom 64 was, and everyone was starting to get bored with Doom ports. I guess you could say the game was doomed to fail. Get it? Okay, I got that out of my system. That's pretty much all the gloomy stuff I have to say about the game. Thankfully, this story does have a happy ending, though. With the remastered Doom 64's release, oblivious people such as myself have finally gotten to experience this forsaken entry in the series. And you know what? The consensus is, this game was pretty good. If you can get your mitts on a copy, I totally would do that. And that wraps things up for this time. Thanks everyone for watching my stuff. It'd also be super cool if you left a like, or maybe a comment or two, but you know, no pressure or anything. Also, I am planning to do some non-N64 stuff in the future, so keep your eyes peeled. Until next time, see ya!